When I pulled into my driveway, my neighbor was already standing there furious. She yelled that my grandkids were crying too loud at night. I stared at her completely confused and told her I did not have any grandkids. She crossed her arms and said she watched my daughter carrying them inside every single night. The very next day, I installed hidden cameras, pretended to leave on a trip, and hid in my own basement. What I saw on my phone screen terrified me to my core. If you are just starting this story, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you will make you question the people you trust the most. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments where you are watching this from. It means the world to me. My name is Victor Hammond. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and a widower. Ever since I lost my wife Sarah a few years ago, my life has been quiet. Too quiet, some might say. I live alone in a large, older 3-story house in Westchester County, New York. It is a house with good bones, solid foundations, and a massive double sub-basement that I spent decades maintaining. I thought I knew every inch of this property. I thought I knew exactly who had access to it. My daughter Natalie is 34 and works as a social worker. Her husband Preston is 38 and works in healthcare administration. To the outside world, they are saints. They dedicate their lives to helping people. They even moved closer to my neighborhood to, as they said, keep an eye on my health. I was grateful. I thought I had raised a wonderful, compassionate daughter. I had no idea that the woman I raised was hiding a dark, monstrous secret right beneath my feet. It was a Tuesday evening just past twilight when the illusion began to shatter. I had just returned from a late grocery run. The weather was unusually warm for an autumn evening, and I was feeling tired, looking forward to nothing more than a quiet cup of decaf coffee and a book. As I turned my truck into the driveway, my headlights illuminated a figure standing directly in front of my garage doors. I hit the brakes, squinting through the windshield. It was Martha. Martha is my 76-year-old neighbor. She is a sharp, observant woman who misses absolutely nothing that happens on our street. Some people call her nosy, but Sarah and I always appreciated her vigilance. But tonight, Martha did not look like her usual self. She looked exhausted, disheveled, and visibly angry. Before I could even put the truck in park, she was marching up to my driver's side window. I rolled it down, offering a polite greeting, but she cut me off immediately. "Victor!" She snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. "You need to do something about the noise. It is completely out of hand." I blinked, genuinely baffled. "Noise? What noise, Martha?" "It is just me in there. I do not even have the television on loud. Do not play games with me, Victor. I am talking about your grandkids. They are too loud at night. It is 3 o'clock in the morning, and the crying is echoing straight across the property line into my bedroom. It sounds like they are terrified, and it has been going on for a week." I stared at her, feeling a strange chill creep down my spine despite the warm air. "Martha," I said gently, trying to keep my voice steady. "You know Natalie does not have any children. I do not have any grandkids. There are no children in my house." Martha's eyes narrowed, and she let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Do not lie to me to cover for her," she said. "I see your daughter carrying them in every single night." The world seemed to stop spinning for a fraction of a second. My mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. Natalie. Carrying children into my house every night. I shook my head, insisting she must have seen someone else, or perhaps she was confused. But Martha was not a woman who suffered fools, nor did she tolerate being called confused. She reached into the pocket of her thick wool cardigan and pulled out her smartphone. "You think I am losing my mind?" she challenged, tapping fiercely on her screen. "Watch this." She shoved the phone through the open window of my truck. I took it, my hands feeling strangely numb. The screen showed a video clearly recorded from Martha's second-floor bedroom window, which directly overlooks my driveway and the side entrance to my garage. The footage was grainy, shot in the dead of night under the dim amber glow of the street lamps, but it was clear enough. I watched as a large black SUV slowly reversed into my driveway. The brake lights illuminated the license plate. It was Natalie's car. The garage door opened silently, swallowing the vehicle. But the camera captured the moment the doors opened, and the interior garage lights flickered on. I saw Preston step out of the driver's side. He walked to the back, opened the trunk, and pulled out a large, heavy car seat. It was covered completely with a thick, gray blanket. Then Natalie emerged from the passenger side, pulling out another covered car seat. They moved with a hurried, practiced efficiency, glancing over their shoulders, before disappearing through the internal door that leads straight into my kitchen and down to the basement stairs. The video ended. I sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The silence in the cabin of my truck was deafening. I looked up at Martha. Her anger had faded, replaced by a deep, unsettling concern. "Victor," she whispered, her tone softening. "I am not trying to be a nuisance, but the way those babies cry, it is not normal. It sounds muffled, muted, like they are trapped underground. Are you telling me you honestly had no idea they were doing this?" I handed the phone back to her, my throat suddenly dry as dust. "No, Martha," I croaked. "I swear to you I had no idea." She looked at me with a profound sadness, nodded slowly, and walked back toward her house, leaving me alone in the dark. My mind was a chaotic storm of rationalizations and terrifying possibilities. Why would Natalie and Preston bring children into my house at 3 a.m? Whose children were they, and why hide them from me? A dark, heavy dread settled in my stomach. The gut feeling of an old man who knew that when people move in the shadows, their intentions are rarely pure. I threw the truck into park, grabbed my keys, and practically ran toward the front door. I unlocked it and burst inside, ignoring the groceries completely. The house was pitch black and dead silent. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood was still there, but the atmosphere felt entirely wrong. It felt violated. I did not turn on the lights. I moved through the hallway, relying on muscle memory, heading straight for the back of the kitchen. That is where the door to the basement is located. For 30 years, that doorway was just a standard wooden interior door with a simple brass knob. It led down to the main utility basement, and from there a secondary staircase descended into the deeper, older sub-basement, where Sarah and I used to keep our wine collection. It was a space I rarely visited anymore since my knees started giving me trouble. I reached out in the dark, my hand expecting to find the familiar curve of the brass knob. Instead, my fingers brushed against cold, flat metal. I frowned, pulling back. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the door. I stopped breathing. The old wooden door was gone. In its place stood a heavy, solid-core steel door. It was industrial grade, the kind you would see in a high-security facility or a bank vault. There were no exposed hinges. The frame had been reinforced with steel plating, drilled directly into the concrete foundation of my home. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire career understanding how things are built, how load-bearing walls work, and how security measures are integrated into physical spaces. I knew exactly what I was looking at. This door had not been installed overnight. It took heavy machinery, professional tools, and significant time. They had to have done it during the days I was away at my physical therapy appointments, piece by piece, right under my nose. They had anchored the frame deep into the surrounding masonry, ensuring that no amount of brute force from a crowbar or sledgehammer would ever breach it. It was designed not just to keep people out, but to ensure that whatever was inside could never, ever escape. Where the doorknob should have been, there was a sleek, modern biometric keypad, glowing with a faint red light, a fingerprint scanner. I reached out my hand, trembling uncontrollably, and touched the cold steel. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A sharp beep echoed in the silent kitchen, and the light flashed a harsh, denying crimson. Access denied. I was locked out of my own basement. I pressed my ear against the freezing metal surface, holding my breath, straining to hear anything through the dense insulation of the door. At first, there was only the sound of my own racing heartbeat, but then, faint and muffled by layers of concrete and steel, I heard it. A low, rhythmic humming, like the sound of industrial medical equipment. And beneath that hum, something else. A soft, desperate whimper. It was not a dog. It was a child. I pulled away from the door, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. My own daughter. My own flesh and blood had turned the bowels of my home into a fortress. She had locked me out. And she was hiding something, breathing, something crying in the dark. I knew in that moment that confronting them would be a fatal mistake. If they had gone to these lengths to build a vault in my home, they were dangerous. I needed to know exactly what was behind that steel door, and I needed to do it without them ever knowing I was watching. The old Victor Hammond, the trusting father, died in the kitchen that night. Tomorrow I would become the architect of their downfall. The hardest truth any parent can face is that the child they raised might not be the person they thought they knew. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a smiling face can hide the darkest of intentions. I learned that ignoring your gut feeling to keep the peace will only make you a victim in your own home. True strength is not about protecting your family at all costs. It is about having the courage to tear down your own world when you realize it is built on evil. Morality must always come before blood. Sunday arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity that mirrored the tension knotting my chest. I spent the afternoon in the kitchen, mechanically preparing a pot roast with root vegetables exactly the way my late wife Sarah used to make it. Cooking had always been my therapy, a process of following steps to achieve a predictable result. But today, the smell of rosemary and slow-cooked beef offered no comfort. Every time I chopped a carrot or stirred the gravy, my eyes involuntarily drifted toward the hallway, toward that heavy steel door. The muffled sounds had stopped during the day, replaced by a sickening, heavy silence that felt even worse. I had to force my hands to stop shaking. I was a 70-year-old retired structural engineer, a man who had spent his life dealing in facts measurements and load-bearing realities. Panic had no place in my current equation. I needed to act the part of the clueless, grateful father. When the doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, I took a deep breath, plastered a warm smile across my face, and went to open it. Natalie stood on the porch holding a bottle of Merlot, wearing a simple, understated floral dress. She had mastered the look of the humble, overworked social worker. Preston stood beside her, clad in a crisp polo shirt and designer slacks, radiating the polished confidence of a healthcare administrator who spent more time on golf courses than in hospitals. They hugged me. I hugged them back, feeling the hollow falseness of their embrace. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to push them away and demand the code to the basement. We sat at the dining table, the clinking of silverware acting as a metronome to the agonizingly casual conversation. Natalie complained about the lack of funding at her agency. Preston boasted about a new efficiency protocol he had implemented at his clinic. They were so normal, so convincing. It terrified me how easily they wore their masks. I waited until I was pouring the second glass of wine before I made my move. I kept my voice light, injecting just the right amount of innocent elderly confusion into my tone. I went to grab a bottle of the old vintage we keep down in the cellar last night, I said, setting the wine bottle down on the table. But I noticed the door was completely changed. It looks like a bank vault, sweetheart. And there is some sort of electronic lock on it now. Did you two do that? Natalie did not even blink. Her hand holding her wine glass remained perfectly steady. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, looking at Preston with a practiced expression of mild exhaustion. I knew you would find it eventually, Dad, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I was going to tell you, but I did not want to stress you out. You know how you worry about my work. What is there to worry about? I asked, leaning forward, playing the concerned father to perfection. Natalie set her glass down and reached across the table to cover my hand with hers. Her skin was warm, but her touch felt reptilian. You know the underground animal rescue I volunteer for? The one that takes in severely abused and confiscated fighting dogs. We had an emergency situation last week. A raid down in the city. The shelters are completely over capacity, and these poor dogs are terrified, traumatized, and frankly, a little dangerous right now. They need absolute isolation and darkness to decompress. I stared at her, letting her words hang in the air. Dogs. She was looking me right in the eye and telling me she was hiding abused fighting dogs in my sub-basement. I know I should have asked permission. She continued, her voice trembling slightly in a masterful display of manufactured emotion. But we were desperate. The steel door is just a precaution. It is soundproofed to keep their barking from waking you up at night, and the lock is to make absolutely sure they do not accidentally get out and hurt you. I could never forgive myself if one of those poor, frightened animals bit you. Preston chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a reassuring smile. It is just temporary, Victor. Give it a few weeks until we can process them and find proper rehabilitative foster homes. Natalie is just too soft-hearted. She wants to save every stray she finds. But your safety comes first. That is why I insisted on the heavy-duty door. The lie was breathtaking in its construction. It accounted for everything. It explained the unauthorized construction. It explained the lock. It even provided a convenient alibi for the muffled crying Martha and I had heard. They were banking on my paternal pride. They expected me to look at my daughter and see a tireless savior of innocent creatures. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew how fighting dogs sounded. They barked, they growled, they scratched at walls. They did not cry with the soft, gasping sobs of human toddlers. Well, I said, managing a gentle, accommodating chuckle. You always did have a soft spot for strays, Natalie. But you really should have told me. I am an old man, and finding a vault in my kitchen was quite a shock. I am so sorry, Dad, she said, her eyes shining with fake, unshed tears. I promise I will keep them quiet. You will not even know they are there. Preston cleared his throat, setting his napkin on the table. Actually, Victor, speaking of your safety, I was thinking about this on the drive over. Having aggressive dogs in the house, even behind a steel door, makes me a bit uneasy about leaving you alone. The neighborhood has had a few break-ins recently, too. I picked up a surplus security camera system from the clinic. State-of-the-art stuff. High-definition night vision, the works. I would feel a lot better if I could set it up for you today. Just to keep an eye on the main floor and make sure the strays stay put. The Trojan horse had been wheeled into my dining room. They were not offering me security. They were establishing surveillance. They needed to monitor my movements to ensure I did not try to break into the basement or bring anyone else into the house while they were running their operation. They needed me compliant, visible, and controlled. I put on a warm, grateful smile, nodding slowly. That is very thoughtful of you, Preston. I suppose a little extra security could not hurt an old man living alone, if it is not too much trouble for you to set up. Not at all, Preston beamed, standing up from the table with eager enthusiasm. I actually have the boxes in the trunk of my car right now. I can get them mounted and wired into your Wi-Fi router before we even cut the pie. I watched him walk out to his car, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. When he returned, he carried 2 sleek, dome-shaped cameras and a small control hub. For the next 40 minutes, I sat in my armchair, sipping my wine and chatting aimlessly with Natalie while Preston worked. He drilled one camera into the upper corner of the main hallway ceiling and the second one into the crown molding of the living room. As a structural engineer, that my brain naturally processes spatial geometry, angles of trajectory and lines of sight. It is a reflex I cannot turn off. As Preston adjusted the lenses, tightening the final screws, I traced the invisible lines radiating from the camera domes. I analyzed the field of view based on the specific tilt he was setting. The blood in my veins turned to ice. If Preston truly wanted to monitor the basement door to ensure no dangerous dogs escaped, he would have pointed the hallway camera directly at the kitchen threshold. But he did not. He angled it slightly to the left. It completely bypassed the kitchen entrance. Instead, It provided a flawless, unobstructed high-definition view of my bedroom door and the main staircase. The second camera in the living room was angled precisely to capture the front door and the large bay windows. They were not watching the basement. They did not care about the basement. The cameras were blind to the vault. They were watching me. I realized the horrifying truth of my reality. I was no longer a homeowner offering shelter to my daughter. I was an inmate in a panopticon of their design. They needed to know when I went to sleep, when I woke up, and if I ever tried to leave the house in the middle of the night. They were managing my entire existence to protect whatever unspeakable secret they were hiding beneath my feet. "There you go, Victor," Preston announced, dusting his hands off with a satisfied smirk. "All set up. You are completely secure now." I looked at him, forcing the corners of my mouth to rise into an expression of profound, fatherly gratitude. "Thank you, Preston. That brings me a lot of peace of mind." They left shortly after dessert, kissing my cheek and promising to visit again soon. As soon as I heard their tires roll out of the driveway, I stood in the center of my hallway. I looked up at the small, unblinking glass eye of the camera mounted in the corner. The faint red glow of the infrared sensor indicated it was actively recording my every move. I was trapped. But as I stared back at the lens, a fierce, protective rage ignited in my chest. They thought I was a fragile, gullible old man. They thought their technology made them invincible. They forgot who built this house. They forgot who they were dealing with. Tomorrow, the hunt would truly begin. For 3 days, my home felt like a maximum security prison. I moved through the hallways with my head down, forcing a pleasant expression whenever I walked through the invisible surveillance cones. Preston had installed top-of-the-line equipment. The cameras had a 120-degree field of view equipped with thermal sensors and high-definition audio. If I coughed too loudly, they would hear it. If I stepped out of my bedroom after midnight, a notification would ping his phone. I was a hostage forced to play the role of a grateful old man while a nightmare unfolded beneath my floorboards. Every evening, Natalie brought over dinner, chatting cheerfully about her social work. She casually asked if the dogs were keeping me awake. I smiled and told her I slept like a rock. But the truth was, I did not sleep at all. When the house went dark, I lay in my bed listening. I knew the acoustic properties of this house better than anyone. A dog barking has a sharp, percussive frequency. It echoes with a distinct resonance. The sounds bleeding through the floor joists from the sub-basement were not percussive. They were soft, rhythmic, and desperate. They were the muffled, suffocated sobs of human children. My gut screamed the truth, but an engineer does not operate on instinct alone. I needed physical, undeniable proof. I needed data. And I knew exactly where people discarded the data they thought no one would ever look for. The trash. Earlier that evening, I watched from the kitchen window as Natalie hauled 2 black garbage bags out to the curb. Tomorrow was collection day. The sanitation trucks rolled through around 5 in the morning. If I wanted to see what my daughter was throwing away, I had a narrow window. I waited until 2 in the morning. The house was completely dead silent. I stood at the threshold of my bedroom door, staring into the dark hallway. The camera was mounted perfectly in the corner, its infrared sensor glowing like a red demon eye. I knew its blind spots. The sensor operated on a downward conical angle, meaning there was a dead zone approximately 18 inches from the floor directly beneath it. To reach the side door leading to the garage, I would have to crawl. At 70 years old, my knees were bone grinding on bone. My lower back was a knot of arthritic pain. But adrenaline is a powerful painkiller. I lowered myself to the hardwood floor, wincing as my joints popped. I flattened my body against the cold wood. I began to pull myself forward, military style, inch by inch. The process was agonizingly slow. Every drag of my elbows sent flares of sharp pain up my spine. I kept my eyes fixed on the red light above me, terrified it would blink to signal motion detection. I dragged myself past the hallway rug, moving silently like a ghost through the home I had paid for with decades of hard labor. My breath came in shallow gasps. The physical exertion was immense, but the terror of being caught fueled my movements. It took me 20 minutes to cross the 20-foot span of the hallway and reach the dead angle behind the kitchen counter. From there, I slipped through the side door into the garage. The air in the garage smelled of motor oil and damp earth. I bypassed my truck and opened the side service door leading to the alleyway where the trash bins were lined up. The night air hit my face, providing a brief moment of relief. The street was empty, bathed in the yellow light of the sodium street lamps. I crept over to the municipal bins. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew that if a patrol car drove by, or if Martha happened to be looking out her window, I would have a hard time explaining why I was digging through my own garbage in the middle of the night. I lifted the heavy plastic lid. Inside were the 2 black bags Natalie had deposited earlier. They were double-knotted. I pulled a small pocket knife from my trousers and sliced the heavy plastic open. A wave of foul odors hit my nose, but I ignored it. I plunged my hands into the refuse, methodically sifting through discarded coffee grounds, empty milk cartons, and junk mail. I was looking for anything related to dogs: empty cans of wet food, torn bags of kibble, discarded chew toys, training pads. If she was housing abused fighting dogs in my basement, there would be massive amounts of canine waste and food packaging. I searched the first bag thoroughly. Nothing. Not a single trace of animal care supplies. I moved to the second bag, my hands coated in grime, my breathing harsh in the quiet alley. I sliced it open from top to bottom. I spread the contents out within the plastic bin, using the faint ambient light from the street to inspect every item. I pushed aside paper towels and empty vegetable cans. Then my fingers brushed against something soft and pliable. I pulled it out and held it up. It was a silicone baby pacifier. It was small mint green and designed for a human infant. My stomach dropped. I kept digging, my movements frantic, now driven by a horrifying realization. I pulled out a wad of crumpled, soiled materials. They were adult-sized medical gloves, the thick nitrile kind used in clinical settings. They were stained with dried bodily fluids and a sticky yellowish substance. I tossed them aside and dug deeper, scraping the bottom of the bag. My fingers caught on a piece of thick, glossy paper stuck to a discarded cardboard box. I pulled it loose and smoothed it out. It was a prescription label, partially torn, but the bold, black text was still legible. It did not list a veterinary clinic. It listed a prominent local pharmacy. The medication name printed on the label was a heavy pediatric-grade sedative, a powerful narcotic used to keep young children unconscious during intense medical procedures. The dosage instructions were alarmingly high. I stood there in the dark alley, staring at the torn piece of paper in my trembling hand. The pacifier, the medical gloves, the pediatric sedatives, the complete absence of dog food or animal waste, the puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. My daughter was not running an animal rescue. She and Preston were holding human children captive in my sub-basement. They were sedating them to keep them quiet. They were using my home as a prison. Nausea washed over me, followed by unadulterated rage. They were monsters. I tucked the pacifier and label into my pocket, rearranging the bags to look exactly as before. I closed the lid. I had to go back inside. I had to crawl under those cameras, climb into bed, and pretend to be the foolish father they thought I was. I had to wait. Confronting them now would put children in jeopardy. I needed a plan. I was going to tear their operation apart tonight. I crawled back into my bedroom through the dark hallway, my body aching from the physical strain, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I slipped beneath the heavy quilt, staring at the ceiling, until the morning sun began to bleed through the blinds. I knew that the moment I stepped out of this room, I was on stage. Every facial expression, every sigh, every shuffling footstep would be recorded, transmitted, and analyzed by my son-in-law. I forced my muscles to relax, putting on the mask of the weary, oblivious old man they believed me to be. I shuffled into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and picked up my cell phone. I dialed my daughter's number, knowing Preston was likely listening in. When Natalie answered, her voice was chirpy, a flawless imitation of a loving child checking on her elderly father. I told her that the house felt a little too quiet, a little too empty, and that my arthritis was acting up from the changing autumn weather. I announced that I had decided to take a spontaneous 5-day fishing trip up to a remote cabin I used to visit with Sarah, deep in the Adirondacks. I made sure to emphasize that the cabin was entirely off the grid, boasting about how nice it would be to spend a few days without cell service or internet. Natalie played her part perfectly, expressing mild concern for my health before quickly pivoting to enthusiastic support. She told me it was exactly what I needed, a chance to clear my head and relax. She even offered to come over and help me pack, but I cheerfully declined, insisting I needed to sort through my old gear myself. Hanging up the phone, I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. They were thrilled. My absence gave them 5 completely uninterrupted days to run their operation without the burden of managing my schedule or keeping me away from the basement door. For the next 2 hours, I made a deliberate spectacle of my preparations. I dragged my heavy canvas duffel bags from the hall closet, ensuring I walked directly beneath the sightline of the camera Preston had installed in the main hallway. I hauled out my old tackle boxes, my waterproof boots, and my heavy winter coats, piling them near the front door. I muttered to myself about the weather playing the part of the distracted retiree. I wanted the footage to be undeniable. If they checked the logs, they would see a man fully committed to leaving the state. Around noon, I carried the last of my gear to my truck, parking it squarely in the driveway so the living room camera could capture my departure. I locked the front door with exaggerated care, walked down the driveway, and climbed into the driver's seat. As I backed out into the street, I glanced at Martha's house, hoping she was not watching, hoping she would not inadvertently blow my cover if she saw me return later. I drove out of the neighborhood, keeping my speed steady, merging onto the highway and heading north. But I did not drive toward the mountains. I drove directly toward the regional airport. I needed my truck to vanish completely. I navigated into the long-term economy parking lot, pulling a ticket and parking my vehicle in a distant shaded corner where it would not attract attention. I grabbed a small backpack I had packed with essentials, leaving the fishing gear sitting uselessly in the truck bed. I walked to the airport terminal, my gait purposeful and steady. Inside the bustling concourse, I found a small electronics kiosk. I purchased a cheap prepaid cell phone and 3 charging cables, paying entirely in cash. I needed a line of communication that Preston could not trace, ping, or monitor. With my new device secured in my jacket pocket, I walked out to the taxi stand. I hailed a cab and gave the driver an address 3 blocks away from my actual street. The ride back to Westchester County felt like an eternity. I sat in the back of the taxi, watching the familiar suburban landscape blur past the window, my mind running through the blueprints of my own house. I knew the structural layout perfectly, every joist, every pipe, every forgotten access point. When the taxi dropped me off, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, plunging the quiet, tree-lined streets into deep twilight. I waited until the taxi's taillights disappeared around the corner before I moved. I walked through the shadows of the neighboring yards, avoiding the glow of the street lamps. I approached my property from the rear, slipping through a dense patch of overgrown evergreen shrubs that lined the wooden fence separating my backyard from the municipal greenbelt. I moved with agonizing caution, testing every step to ensure I did not snap a dry twig or rustle the dry autumn leaves. I bypassed the motion sensor floodlights I had installed years ago, navigating the narrow strip of grass behind the garage. I crouched low, pressing my back against the cold brick foundation of the house. I was completely invisible from the street, hidden from Martha's watchful windows, and entirely outside the view of Preston's indoor cameras. I shimmied along the foundation wall until I reached a heavy patch of ivy clinging to the brickwork. Behind this thick curtain of vines was a feature of the house that had not been used in more than 4 decades. When Sarah and I first purchased the property, the original heating system relied on a basement coal furnace. The metal coal chute built flush against the exterior brick line had been sealed shut from the inside when we upgraded the plumbing, but it was never structurally removed. I reached through the damp ivy, my fingers finding the rusted iron latch of the chute cover. I had quietly oiled the hinges a week prior, a minor maintenance task that now felt like divine providence. I gripped the latch and pulled. With a soft metallic groan, the heavy iron door swung outward, revealing a narrow, pitch-black tunnel sloping down into the belly of the house. A wave of stagnant, musty air washed over my face. I quickly grabbed my flashlight from my dark backpack, keeping the beam clicked off to avoid casting any stray light into the yard. I slid my legs into the narrow opening, easing my torso down the steep metal incline. The space was incredibly tight, scraping against my shoulders and back, threatening to wedge me firmly in place. I pushed through the claustrophobic panic, shimmying downward until my boots touched the concrete ledge. I pulled the iron door shut behind me, sealing myself in total, suffocating darkness. I stood up slowly, brushing the decades of accumulated coal dust from my jacket. I was inside the hidden walls, quietly breathing the exact same cold air as the vile monsters who had violently hijacked my peaceful life. I was absolutely no longer a helpless victim or a foolish, clueless father. I was now a silent phantom inside my own home, fully prepared and ready to hunt them down. The coal chute led directly into the primary utility shaft, a narrow concrete corridor running parallel to the main basement. I stood in the stifling darkness, letting my eyes adjust. I knew exactly where I needed to go. Above me, running along the ceiling, was the main return vent for the heating system. It was a wide rectangular duct made of galvanized steel. I reached up, gripping a sturdy cast iron water pipe to hoist myself upward. The physical toll was immediate and severe. Pain flared in my shoulders, and my arthritic knees screamed in protest as I pulled my 70-year-old frame toward the ceiling. I managed to unlatch the maintenance panel on the bottom of the duct. I slid my upper body inside, followed by my legs, moving into the metallic throat of my own house. The air inside the vent was dry and coated my throat with dust. Every small movement echoed like a drumbeat in my ears, but I knew the sound would not travel through the soundproofed floors my daughter had constructed. I dragged myself forward on my stomach. Inch by agonizing inch, I moved through the steel tunnel. The metal dug into my chest and scraped against my elbows. I focused solely on my breathing, keeping it slow and measured through my nose. I had to bypass the steel door and reach the ventilation drop servicing the sub-basement. It took me 20 minutes of grueling labor to travel 30 feet. My muscles burned intensely, but the adrenaline pulsing through my veins pushed the fatigue aside. Finally, the duct took a sharp downward turn. I peeked through the slats of the vent grate. Below me was the sub-basement, safely behind the biometric steel door. It was completely pitch black. I pulled my pocket knife from my jacket and wedged the blade under the corner of the grate. I applied slow, steady pressure until the metal clips popped free with a soft click. I eased the grate out and set it quietly aside. Now came the hardest part. I had to drop down without breaking an ankle. I swung my legs over the edge, gripping the rim of the duct. I lowered myself until I was hanging by my fingertips. I let go. I landed heavily on the concrete floor, my knees buckling under the impact, but I managed to roll onto my shoulder to absorb the shock. I lay there for a moment, waiting for a flare of pain that might indicate a broken bone. Miraculously, I was intact. I slowly pushed myself up to a standing position. The air down here was different. It smelled sharp, sterile, and heavily chemical. I reached into my pocket, retrieved my small flashlight, and clicked it on. The narrow beam of light pierced the darkness, sweeping across the room. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. There were no dog cages or bags of kibble. My daughter had gutted the historical brick space and transformed it into a pristine medical ward. The walls were lined with thick acoustic soundproofing foam, designed to kill any noise before it could reach the floorboards above. The floor was covered in sterile linoleum. But what occupied the center of the room made me drop to my knees. Arranged in a neat, horrifying row were 4 iron cribs. They looked like hospital beds designed for infants, complete with adjustable side rails. I walked toward the first crib, my hand shaking violently, as the flashlight beam danced across the metal bars. Neatly folded at the foot of the mattress were thick padded nylon restraints. These were not meant to keep a child from falling. They were designed to tie a child down. Beside each crib stood a towering metal intravenous drip stand equipped with digital fluid monitors and tangled plastic tubing. Discarded adult medical gloves lay in a biohazard bin near the corner. On a stainless steel rolling cart nearby, I found a neat stack of manila folders. I aimed my flashlight at the documents. They were Medicare billing files and insurance claim forms. I opened the top folder. The name listed was an unfamiliar foreign surname. The date of birth indicated the child was 3 years old. The diagnosis codes listed severe chronic respiratory illnesses. The billing amounts requested from the state were astronomical, reaching into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I opened another folder to find another infant and another list of complex, highly expensive medical treatments. My daughter and her husband were not rescuing animals. They were operating a phantom pediatric ward. They were harboring undocumented children, claiming them as critically ill dependents, and siphoning massive amounts of government funds into their own pockets. To keep the children from making noise, they were keeping them heavily sedated and tied to these iron cages. The sheer scale of the evil was incomprehensible. I had financed the very house they were using as a dungeon. I shoved the billing folders back into their neat stack, ensuring everything looked exactly as I had found it. I reached into my backpack and pulled out the set of wireless microcameras I had purchased earlier with cash. I had to move quickly. I did not know when Natalie and Preston would return to check on their hidden ward. I attached the first camera to the upper corner of the ceiling, directly facing the biometric door. I placed the second camera behind a stack of sterile gauze boxes on the medical cart, ensuring a clear view of the 4 iron cribs. I linked the cameras to my burner phone, testing the live feed in the darkness. The night vision functioned perfectly, broadcasting a crisp green image directly to my screen. The trap was set. I just needed a place to wait. I slipped out of the medical ward and moved quietly into the adjoining wine cellar. This room had remained largely untouched. The old wooden wine racks I had built by hand decades ago still lined the walls covered in thick dust. I walked to the far end of the cellar, stopping in front of a large rack bolted to the back wall. When I built this room, I had designed a hollow void behind the brickwork to house a climate control unit that I never installed. I reached behind the 4th shelf and triggered the hidden release catch. The heavy wooden rack swung outward smoothly, revealing a dark, narrow cavity just large enough for a grown man to sit comfortably. I stepped inside the void, pulling the heavy rack shut, until the latch clicked securely back into place. I sat down on the cold, concrete floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The darkness inside the wall was absolute. I turned down the brightness on my burner phone and quickly opened the camera application. The live feed from the medical ward glowed softly in the palm of my hand. I leaned my tired head back against the cold brick. I had the evidence of their fraud, but I needed proof of their physical crimes. I needed to catch them with the children. I slowed my breathing, letting the icy silence of the basement settle around me. I was prepared to wait all night if necessary. The hours bled into one another as I sat folded inside the narrow, pitch-black cavity of the wine cellar wall. The cold concrete numbed my legs while the brick dust clawed at my throat. I breathed through my nose, drawing shallow drafts of stale air. Every arthritic muscle in my 70-year-old body screamed in stiff protest, but I dared not shift my weight. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing rectangle of my burner phone. The live feed bathed my face in pale green light. For a long time, nothing moved. The 4 iron cribs stood empty under the night vision lens like skeletal cages waiting for their prisoners. At exactly 3:15, the heavy vibration of footsteps rolled down the main staircase, transmitting perfectly through the floor joists. A sharp beep echoed from the adjacent room as the biometric keypad processed a fingerprint. Metallic clanks followed. The deadbolts retracted, and the massive steel door swung open with a heavy hum. Brilliant, sterile white light flooded the medical ward, blinding the night vision lens for a fraction of a second before the camera rapidly adjusted its exposure. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the brick. Natalie stepped into the frame first, still wearing the floral dress she wore at my dining table hours earlier, when she smiled and fed me lies about rescuing dogs. The sweet, compassionate social worker mask was completely gone. Her face was set in a rigid, cold expression of pure, unadulterated focus. She moved with a chilling, practiced efficiency. Preston followed close behind her, dressed in a dark tracksuit. But it was what they were carrying that made the remaining breath vanish from my lungs. They were not carrying dog kennels or animal supplies. They were lugging two massive, heavy-duty canvas duffel bags. The bags were the size of large suitcases, the kind meant for transporting hockey equipment or tactical gear. They strained under the weight, the thick nylon straps digging into their shoulders as they hauled the bags into the center of the sterile room. Preston dropped his bag onto the linoleum floor with a heavy, sickening thud that reverberated through the foundation. Natalie set hers down with only slightly more care on top of the stainless steel medical cart. They did not exchange a single word. They operated in total rehearsed silence, moving around each other in a macabre ballet that suggested they had done this exact routine dozens of times before. I watched my daughter, the child I had raised, pull a pair of blue nitrile medical gloves from a dispenser on the wall and snap them over her hands. Preston grabbed the zipper of the duffel bag on the floor and yanked it open. I brought the screen closer to my face, my eyes burning, as I desperately tried to comprehend the grainy image. A small, limp arm spilled out over the dark canvas edge. It was clad in a faded yellow pajamas sleeve. Preston reached his hands into the dark maw of the bag and hauled the contents upward. It was a little boy, no older than 3. The child was completely unresponsive. His head rolled back lifelessly against Preston's forearm, his small face pale and slack. His eyes were closed shut, his breathing so shallow that his chest barely seemed to rise. Preston did not handle the boy with any semblance of care or humanity. He gripped the child by the waist, carried him over to the first iron crib, and dropped him onto the thin plastic-covered mattress. Natalie was already unzipping the second bag on the cart. She reached inside and pulled out a tiny girl with dark, tangled curls. The girl was equally limp, her small body heavily sedated, lost to the world in a chemically induced paralysis. Natalie carried the girl to the second crib. She did not cradle the child. She held her away from her own body exactly the way a warehouse worker might carry a sack of flour. She placed the little girl on the mattress and immediately reached for the thick nylon restraints dangling from the metal rails. With practiced, rapid movements, my daughter strapped the heavy buckles across the toddler's chest, waist, and ankles, securing the child to the iron frame. Preston mirrored her actions, binding the little boy to his crib with ruthless efficiency. Then he moved to the intravenous drip stands. He grabbed a pre-filled saline bag, injected with a yellowish fluid, and hung it on the metal hook. He found a vein in the little boy's arm, inserted the needle, and taped it down. The digital monitors flared to life, tracking heart rates and oxygen levels. They were preparing these children like livestock for processing. I felt a violent surge of nausea claw at my throat. I had to bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming, swallowing the metallic taste of blood to maintain my absolute silence in the wall void. I had believed they were running a scam, stealing government funds by claiming phantom dependents. But this physical, mechanical brutality was far worse than mere financial fraud. They were trafficking human beings right beneath my kitchen. Before I could fully process the nightmare playing out on my screen, the heavy steel door hummed again. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Natalie and Preston did not flinch. They simply turned toward the entrance, expecting company. A third person stepped into the frame of my hidden camera. He was a tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, with graying hair, meticulously styled. He wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in a concrete basement. In his right hand, he carried a vintage, hard-shell medical case made of dark leather. He walked into the sterile ward with an air of absolute authority, barely glancing at Natalie or Preston. His cold, calculating eyes went straight to the iron cribs. He set his leather case on the stainless steel cart and popped the brass latches. He pulled out a clipboard and a series of glass vials containing a cloudy, thick liquid. He tapped a syringe against his palm, looking down at the sedated little girl. He did not ask how the transport went. He did not ask if the children were healthy. He simply turned his head toward Preston, his voice dry and completely devoid of emotion. "Are the subjects properly prepped for the trial?" he asked. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The trial. My mind instantly raced back to the torn prescription label I had found in the trash. It was not just heavy sedatives to keep the children quiet while they stole Medicare money. It was something infinitely darker. They were not just hiding these undocumented children for simple profit. They were using my basement as a clandestine laboratory. They were selling these defenseless toddlers to a corrupt medical syndicate, using them as disposable human lab rats for illegal, off-the-books pharmaceutical trials. I clutched the burner phone against my violently shaking chest, realizing the horrific depth of my daughter's depravity. My own home had become a house of horrors. The man in the sharp suit stepped closer to the cribs. He pulled a small penlight from his breast pocket and shined it directly into the little boy's half-open eyes. The child did not even twitch. The man grunted in approval, checking the digital readout on the intravenous monitor. I sat frozen beside the dark brick cavity of the wine cellar, gripping my burner phone so tightly my knuckles ached. The audio feed from the hidden cameras transmitted their hushed clinical voices directly into my earpiece. The man in the suit, who I now recognized as a high-ranking medical professional, opened his leather case fully. He lined up 3 clear vials of the experimental compound on the stainless steel tray. He looked over at my daughter with a cold, calculating gaze. He asked Natalie if the transport from the border facility had presented any logistical complications. Natalie shook her head, adjusting her medical gloves. She spoke with a terrifyingly casual tone, explaining that her credentials as a senior social worker for the refugee nonprofit granted her absolute, unquestioned access to the holding centers. She detailed how easy it was to falsify the transfer paperwork for undocumented orphans. She targeted the children who had arrived without parents, the ones who had no family members looking for them, the children who were essentially ghosts in the eyes of the government. She simply signed them out under the guise of placing them in specialized emergency foster care, and then she erased their digital footprints from the agency database. Preston chimed in, his voice brimming with a sickening pride. He boasted about his role in the operation, explaining how his position as a regional healthcare administrator allowed him to manipulate the billing network. He created phantom medical profiles for the children using stolen Social Security numbers to funnel massive amounts of state and federal Medicare funds into dummy accounts. But the government fraud was only a fraction of their income. The true profit, the millions of dollars they were accumulating, came directly from the man in the sharp suit. The doctor represented a deeply corrupt network of offshore pharmaceutical developers. These developers needed human test subjects to bypass the agonizingly slow and expensive regulations of legitimate clinical trials. They needed living bodies to test aggressive, highly dangerous compounds for neurological disorders and autoimmune diseases. They paid Preston and Natalie exorbitant sums under the table to provide those bodies. The children strapped to the iron cribs in my sub-basement were completely untraceable. If the experimental drugs caused severe adverse reactions, if they suffered irreversible organ failure, or if they simply did not survive the extreme chemical stress, no one would ever come looking for them. There would be no lawsuits, no grieving parents, and no official autopsies. The victims would simply vanish. I listened to them discuss the financial logistics of the trial, with the casual detachment of stockbrokers analyzing quarterly margins. The doctor mentioned a recent wire transfer of $2 million to Preston's offshore shell company, a payment for the first phase of the neurological trial. He then loaded a syringe with the thick, cloudy liquid from one of the vials. He instructed Preston to adjust the saline drip to prepare the little girl for the injection. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing in the confined darkness of the wall void. The sheer scale of the evil was paralyzing. My daughter, the girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, the woman who had cried when our family dog died, was a key player in an international human trafficking and illegal medical testing ring. She was trading the lives of defenseless refugee toddlers for luxury cars and designer clothes. I watched through the glowing green screen as the doctor approached the second crib. He tapped the syringe to clear the air bubbles, his face a mask of absolute indifference. He noted the child's vital signs on his clipboard, confirming the heavy sedatives had stabilized her heart rate enough to begin the chemical infusion. I wanted to smash through the brick wall, tear the steel door off its hinges, and strangle them all with my bare hands. But I was an unarmed 70-year-old man against two younger men and my daughter. If I revealed myself now, they would silence me instantly, and these children would disappear forever into an unmarked grave. I had to maintain my composure. I had to let them incriminate themselves completely on the digital recording. The doctor finished his brutal work, placing the empty syringes into a biohazard bag inside his leather case. He wiped his hands with an alcohol swab and turned to Preston, a slight frown creasing his forehead. He looked around the soundproofed walls, gesturing to the heavy concrete ceiling above them. He lowered his voice. He injected a tone of cautious skepticism into the conversation. He asked Preston if it was not incredibly risky conducting such a high-level illegal operation directly beneath his father-in-law's house. He pointed out that an elderly man living directly upstairs might hear the monitors, notice the heavy electrical usage, or accidentally stumble upon the biometric lock on the basement door. He expressed concern that a single misplaced suspicion could bring the entire pharmaceutical syndicate crashing down. Preston did not look worried. Instead, he threw his head back and let out a genuine, arrogant laugh. It was a sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. Preston shook his head, placing a reassuring hand on the doctor's tailored shoulder. He smiled with a condescending sneer, a look of supreme overconfidence. He told the doctor that he had absolutely nothing to worry about regarding the old man upstairs. Preston explained that I was completely oblivious, describing me as a lonely, desperate widower who was so pathetic and hungry for family connection that I would believe absolutely any lie they fed me. He laughed again, recounting how easily I had accepted the ridiculous story about hiding abused fighting dogs in the cellar. He boasted about the expensive security cameras he had meticulously installed, explaining that they gave him complete operational control over my every movement. He confidently assured the corrupt doctor that I was currently miles away, isolated in a remote cabin without any cell service, entirely eliminated as a potential threat. Natalie smiled brightly, agreeing completely with her husband's assessment of my profound, pathetic stupidity. I sat frozen in the darkness, the rough concrete pressing against my spine, quietly recording every arrogant word. They believed their wealth and intelligence made them invincible. They believed they were untouchable ghosts operating in the shadows of an old man's home. But they had profoundly miscalculated. They did not realize that the house they chose for their horrors belonged to a structural engineer who knew every hidden vein of the building. They did not realize that the foolish old man they were mocking was sitting less than 20 feet away, armed with the power to absolutely destroy them. Let them laugh. Let them inject their poison. Let them count their millions, because tomorrow the hunter becomes the hunted, and I will burn their empire to the ground. Inside the pitch-black wall void of the wine cellar, I barely allowed myself to breathe. My eyes remained glued to the glowing screen of my burner phone. On the live feed, the doctor adjusted the lapels of his expensive charcoal suit, seemingly satisfied by Preston's overconfident assurances regarding my supposed stupidity. The doctor turned his attention back to the sedated toddlers strapped to the iron cribs. He systematically checked the digital intravenous monitors, verifying that the heavy experimental compounds were flowing smoothly into the small, fragile veins of the undocumented children. He did not see human beings in those cribs. He saw raw data, profitable statistics for his corrupt pharmaceutical syndicate. I watched my daughter Natalie step closer to the stainless steel rolling cart. Her movements were brisk and entirely devoid of the compassionate warmth she projected to the outside world. She reached beneath the stack of sterile gauze boxes where I had hidden my second microcamera and pulled out a thick black leather portfolio. The heavy sound of the zipper breaking the quiet room sent a fresh wave of dread washing over me. I knew exactly what a portfolio like that contained. It was the administrative heart of their dark enterprise. The doctor placed his pen into his breast pocket and looked at Natalie with a severe, uncompromising gaze. He stated that his overseas superiors were demanding absolute guarantees regarding their legal exposure. He needed concrete assurance that the massive financial transfers and the physical location of the phantom pediatric ward could never be traced back to his pharmaceutical network. He demanded to know their fail-safe protocol. Natalie offered him a smile that chilled me to the absolute core. It was a predatory, calculating expression I had never seen on my daughter's face. She opened the black leather portfolio and spread a thick stack of legal documents across the metallic surface of the medical cart. My heart seized violently in my chest. The documents bore the official letterhead of my own personal estate trust. There were articles of incorporation for a newly registered medical research nonprofit organization, property deeds, and several high-yield offshore banking applications. Natalie tapped a manicured fingernail against the bottom of the top page, drawing the doctor's attention to the signature line. Every single document, every dummy corporation, and every bank account holding the illicit millions they were being paid under the table had been registered using my personal information. I stared at the screen in absolute horror as the camera captured the sharp looping strokes of my own signature. It was a flawless, masterful forgery. The doctor leaned over the cart, inspecting the forged signatures with a critical eye. He noted that corporate registration was one thing, but establishing a robust legal defense against federal investigation required a plausible scapegoat. He asked Natalie how they intended to convince federal authorities that an isolated retired structural engineer was secretly masterminding a billion-dollar human trafficking and illegal pharmaceutical testing ring. Natalie did not hesitate. Her voice was steady, dripping with a venomous condescension that shattered whatever remaining illusions I held about my child. She looked the corrupt doctor directly in the eye and delivered a line that I will hear echoing in my nightmares until the day I die. "My dad is a senile old fool," she said, her tone casually dismissive. She explained that she had spent the entire year carefully planting the seeds of my mental decline among my friends, my former colleagues, and my neighbors. But the psychological manipulation was only the surface of her monstrous plan. Natalie reached into the pocket of her floral dress and pulled out a small, unmarked amber vial. She held it up to the fluorescent light, the dark liquid inside catching the harsh glare. "I have been slipping microdoses of heavy lead into his morning coffee for the past 9 months," she confessed smoothly. Natalie explained that chronic low-level lead poisoning precisely mimics the rapid onset of aggressive dementia and severe cognitive impairment. She detailed how the heavy metals caused localized neurological degradation, producing erratic behavior, extreme confusion, and uncontrollable hand tremors. Sitting in the dark wall void, a profound wave of sickening realization crashed over me. The mysterious fatigue that had plagued me since autumn. The sudden, terrifying moments of brain fog. I had attributed all of those terrifying symptoms to my advancing age and the heavy, suffocating grief of losing my dear Sarah. I had genuinely believed my mind and body were naturally failing me. I had trusted my daughter when she brought me specialized nutritional supplements and brewed my morning coffee, completely unaware that she was methodically poisoning me in my own kitchen. She was intentionally destroying my brain to manufacture a perfect, airtight medical alibi. Preston grinned as he explained that by the time the pharmaceutical trials were complete and the undocumented children were ultimately disposed of, my medical records would show a massive undeniable history of severe mental instability. They had already arranged for a corrupt psychiatrist on their payroll to officially diagnose me with paranoid schizophrenia and advanced dementia. Natalie gathered the forged estate documents and slid them neatly back into the dark leather portfolio. She looked at the doctor, her eyes hard and devoid of any human empathy. She laid out the final phase of their exit strategy with chilling precision. She firmly stated that the medical shell company, the banking accounts, and the property were entirely and legally bound to my name. If the federal authorities or the FBI ever raided this sub-basement, they would find my house, my forged signatures, and my chemically damaged, confused brain. If the FBI raids this place, the trail leads straight to Victor Hammond, she concluded coldly. He will die in a federal prison hospital, and we will be sitting on a sunny beach in Belize with our offshore accounts completely full. The doctor nodded, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He expressed his complete satisfaction with their foolproof contingency plan. He picked up his vintage leather medical case, checked his gold wristwatch, and turned toward the heavy biometric steel door. As the three monsters walked out of the medical ward, leaving the sedated, helpless children strapped to their iron cages, the heavy steel door hummed and locked securely behind them. The bright fluorescent lights snapped off automatically, plunging the ward back into deep, terrifying darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the intravenous monitors. Inside the narrow, suffocating, pitch-black wall cavity, I slowly lowered the burner phone to my lap. There was no more shock, no more grief, and absolutely no more paternal love left in my heart. Natalie and Preston had planned to sacrifice my life and my sanity for their greed. They had meticulously and gleefully calculated every single detail of my destruction. But they had made one fatal, catastrophic error. They had explained their entire operation to a man who was already dead to them. I sat in the cold silence, letting a profound, icy resolve solidify in my chest. I was going to tear down their pharmaceutical empire, rescue those innocent children, and make my daughter wish she had never been born. The heavy hum of the biometric steel door echoed through the concrete foundation, followed by the definitive thud of the deadbolts sliding into place. I remained frozen inside the suffocating darkness of the wine cellar wall void, listening intently as the heavy footsteps of my daughter, my son-in-law, and the corrupt doctor retreated up the main staircase. The muffled thumps grew fainter until the house settled into a profound, suffocating silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, counting the steady, rhythmic thumps of my own heartbeat. I needed to be absolutely certain they were gone, that they had retired to their luxurious bedrooms, secure in their arrogant belief that their phantom pediatric ward was entirely safe. When I was convinced the coast was clear, I reached out with trembling hands and found the hidden release catch. I pressed it, pushing my shoulder against the heavy wooden wine rack. It swung open with a soft groan, releasing me from my pitch-black tomb. I stumbled out onto the dusty concrete floor, my joints screaming in protest, my lungs burning as I inhaled the cool, stale air of the cellar. I moved with deliberate, practiced silence, crossing the wine cellar and stepping back into the clinical glare of the medical ward. The stark fluorescent lights had snapped off, leaving the room bathed in the eerie pale green glow of the intravenous monitors. I pulled my small flashlight from my pocket, shielding the lens with my fingers to allow only a narrow sliver of illumination to escape. I walked toward the center of the room, my boots making absolutely no sound on the sterile linoleum. I approached the row of 4 iron cribs. The sight of those children bound and sedated in my own home struck me with a wave of physical agony that was infinitely worse than the heavy lead Natalie had been secretly feeding me. I stepped up to the first crib, gazing down at the little boy they had haphazardly tossed onto the mattress. His chest rose and fell with a shallow, chemically depressed rhythm. I gently reached out my calloused fingers, brushing against his soft, cool cheek. I fought back a sudden, violent surge of tears, swallowing the thick lump of grief that threatened to choke me. I leaned over the second crib, checking the tiny girl with the dark, tangled curls. Her wrists were secured with thick nylon restraints, her delicate skin chafing against the harsh material. I wanted to tear the straps off, to scoop them into my arms and run, but I knew I could not. If I triggered an alarm, if I alerted Preston and Natalie before I secured the undeniable proof of their crimes, these children would disappear forever, and I would spend my final days dying in a federal prison hospital as a diagnosed lunatic. I had to secure the evidence first. I had to guarantee their total, inescapable destruction. I turned away from the cribs, my vision blurry with unshed tears, and focused my attention on the stainless steel rolling cart. The doctor had taken his vintage leather case, but Natalie had left the thick black leather portfolio resting casually next to the biohazard bin. It was a monument to their supreme arrogance. They believed the biometric lock on the steel door provided absolute security, completely dismissing the possibility that a threat could already be inside the vault. I stepped up to the cart and unzipped the portfolio. I pulled out my prepaid burner phone, ensuring the flash was deactivated and the device was set to silent. I opened the first manila folder, illuminating the pages with my narrow flashlight beam. I began to photograph every single document. My hands moved with methodical, mechanical precision. I captured the clinical trial protocols documenting the horrifying dosages of experimental neurological compounds they were pumping into the toddlers. I photographed the dummy corporate registrations, the fake medical nonprofit charters, and the endless stacks of Medicare billing files used to siphon state funds. Then I found the financial heart of their operation. Tucked in the back of the portfolio was a ledger of offshore banking applications. I hovered my phone over the pages, capturing the routing numbers, the shell company aliases, and the massive wire transfer receipts. And there at the bottom of every crucial document was my own name. I stared at the forged signatures through the digital lens of my phone, documenting the exact evidence Natalie planned to use to frame me for her billion-dollar human trafficking ring. I photographed every single page, every single damning detail, creating an unassailable digital archive of their monstrous enterprise. I uploaded the images directly to a secure encrypted cloud server I had set up earlier that day, ensuring that even if they caught me, the evidence would survive. I had just closed the black leather portfolio, my heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and lingering terror, when the absolute worst possible scenario unfolded. A sharp mechanical beep echoed from one of the intravenous monitors. The yellow fluid in the saline bag above the first crib had run completely dry, triggering an automatic low-pressure alarm. The sudden piercing noise shattered the heavy silence of the medical ward. I spun around, my blood freezing solid in my veins. The alarm continued to beep, a steady, relentless chirp that seemed as loud as a fire siren in the enclosed concrete space. I lunged toward the monitor, my fingers frantically searching the digital interface for a mute button. Before I could silence the machine, the little boy in the first crib stirred. The sudden noise, combined with the cessation of the heavy sedative drip, had pulled him from his chemical paralysis. He blinked, his dark eyes open, staring up at the sterile ceiling in profound, groggy confusion. He felt the thick nylon restraints binding his chest and ankles, and panic instantly washed over his small, pale face. He opened his mouth, drew a deep, ragged breath, and began to cry. It was not a soft whimper. It was a loud, piercing wail of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed off the soundproofed walls and vibrated through the floor joists above. I frantically reached through the iron bars, pressing my hand gently over his small chest, whispering desperate, soothing words in an attempt to calm him. But the child was terrified, disoriented, and trapped in a nightmare. His cries only grew louder, a desperate siren broadcasting our location to the monsters sleeping above. I looked up at the ceiling, my breath catching in my throat. Through the heavy layers of concrete and wood, I heard the unmistakable sound of a bedroom door slamming open on the main floor. The heavy, frantic thud of footsteps thundered across the hardwood floorboards, vibrating through the structural beams. Preston had heard the crying. The footsteps pounded down the main staircase, moving with terrifying speed toward the kitchen. He was coming back down to the basement, I was trapped inside the locked medical ward standing over a screaming toddler, with only seconds to spare before the heavy steel door swung wide open and exposed my physical presence to them completely. The heavy thud of footsteps bounding down the wooden stairs vibrated through the concrete ceiling like the beating of a massive, terrifying drum. I had less than 10 seconds. My mind, conditioned by decades of calculating structural load-bearing and crisis management, stripped away the panic and left only pure, terrifying survival instinct. I could not make it back to the hidden void in the wine cellar. The distance was simply too great, and the heavy biometric steel door was already beginning its automated sequence to unlock. I scanned the sterile, brightly lit medical ward in a desperate frenzy. Against the far wall, shoved into a corner past the iron cribs, sat a stack of bulky oxygen concentrators covered by a thick, opaque gray medical tarp. It was my only option. I threw my aching body across the cold linoleum floor, completely ignoring the sharp flare of agony shooting through my arthritic knees and lower back. I grabbed the heavy vinyl edge of the tarp and slid underneath it, pulling the thick material down flush against the floor, just as the electronic deadbolts on the main door retracted with a loud mechanical clack. I pressed my face into the sterile, chemical-smelling dust of the floorboards, curling my limbs inward to make my profile as small as possible. The heavy steel door swung inward, hitting the rubber doorstop with a dull thud. From the narrow gap between the bottom of the tarp and the floor, I could see the harsh yellow light from the hallway spill into the room. A pair of black leather tactical boots stepped over the threshold. My breath caught in my throat, freezing in my lungs. Preston had not come down in his pajamas. He had not come down as a concerned caregiver checking on a restless child. He stepped into the room with the precise, deliberate weight of a predator. In his right hand, gripped with terrifying familiarity, was a black semi-automatic handgun. Attached to the barrel was a long, cylindrical sound suppressor. This was not a man coming to quiet a crying toddler. This was a man coming to eliminate an intruder. The little boy in the first crib continued to scream, his voice echoing shrilly off the acoustic foam lining the walls. Preston did not immediately go to the child. Instead, he stopped just inside the doorway, his boots pivoting slowly as he swept the room. I watched the tip of the suppressed barrel track across my narrow field of vision. He was looking for shadows, for movement, for anything out of place. My heart hammered against my ribs with such violent force I was absolutely certain the sound would betray me. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my body into total rigid paralysis. The black tactical boots began to move. They stepped past the medical cart, pacing slowly along the row of iron cribs. He walked right past the crying toddler, his focus entirely on securing the perimeter. The boots drew closer to the stack of oxygen concentrators, closer to the gray tarp. He stopped. The toes of his leather boots were less than 6 inches from my nose. I could see the fine grain of the leather, the dust clinging to the rubber soles. If he reached down and lifted the edge of the tarp, he would find me curled on the floor. I would be staring down the barrel of a silenced weapon, and my life would end on the cold linoleum of my own basement. I held my breath until my lungs burned, praying to a god I had neglected since Sarah died to make me completely invisible. For 10 agonizing seconds, Preston stood absolutely motionless. Then he let out a sharp, irritated sigh. He holstered the weapon at his hip. The immediate threat of discovery passed, but the nightmare was far from over. He turned on his heel and marched back toward the first iron crib, his heavy footsteps echoing with terrifying purpose. The little boy was practically hyperventilating, now his chest heaving against the thick nylon restraints binding him to the mattress. He was terrified, confused, and desperately crying out for a mother who was thousands of miles away, or perhaps already dead. I watched through the small gap in the tarp as Preston reached the crib. He did not speak softly. He did not offer comfort. He reached into the pocket of his dark tracksuit and pulled out a pre-loaded plastic syringe. His movements were rough, violently impatient. He leaned over the metal railing, his broad shoulders blocking the overhead fluorescent light. He grabbed the little boy by his fragile shoulder, pinning the child down against the mattress with a ruthless, bone-crushing force. The boy shrieked a sound of pure agony that tore right through my soul. Preston uncapped the syringe with his teeth, spitting the plastic cover onto the floor. He pressed the needle into the intravenous port, taped to the boy's small arm. "Just 3 more days, you little rat!" Preston muttered, his voice a low, venomous hiss that carried clearly across the quiet room. "Just 3 more days until the final infusion, and then you are no longer my problem." He slammed his thumb against the plunger, injecting the heavy, cloudy sedative directly into the child's bloodstream. The effect was horrifyingly instantaneous. The boy's frantic, desperate screams dissolved into a wet, gurgling whimper. Within seconds, the child's small body went completely slack. His eyes rolled back, and the thrashing ceased, entirely replaced by the shallow, chemically suppressed breathing I had witnessed earlier. Preston stepped back from the crib, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked down at the unconscious toddler with an expression of profound, sickening disgust. He turned toward the stainless steel rolling cart, muttering a string of vulgar curses under his breath. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a thick, heavily encased burner phone. He tossed it carelessly onto the metal surface of the desk, the heavy plastic case clattering loudly against the stack of forged Medicare billing files. He unholstered his suppressed handgun once more, checking the safety mechanism with a metallic click. Suddenly, the distinct vibration of his primary personal cell phone buzzed from his jacket. He pulled it out, glancing at the glowing screen. "Yes, Natalie, I am down here," Preston answered, his voice dripping with condescending irritation. The little rat woke up and started screaming. "I just put him back under." "No, there is no one down here. The perimeter is perfectly secure. It was just a low-pressure alarm on the saline drip. I am coming back up right now. Go back to sleep." He shoved his personal phone back into his pocket, turning his back on the row of iron cribs. He walked to the exit, his tactical boots thudding softly against the linoleum. The heavy biometric steel door groaned as he pulled it open. He stepped through the threshold, and the door hummed shut behind him. The heavy deadbolt slammed into place with a definitive echoing crash. The bright overhead fluorescent lights automatically snapped off, plunging the medical ward back into the eerie pale green glow of the vital sign monitors. I remained absolutely motionless under the gray tarp for 5 full minutes, letting the complete silence of the basement settle back into my bones. When I was absolutely certain he was gone, I pushed the heavy vinyl material off my back and staggered to my feet. My muscles cramped fiercely, and a wave of dizzying exhaustion threatened to pull me back to the floor. But the anger burning in my chest kept me upright. I walked over to the first iron crib, looking down at the small, limp body of the boy. A single tear tracked through the dust on my cheek. I promised him silently and fiercely that this nightmare would end tonight. I turned away from the crib and stepped toward the stainless steel desk. Sitting perfectly centered on top of the forged clinical trial documents was the thick black burner phone Preston had carelessly left behind. My hands trembled as I reached out and picked it up. It was a secure, encrypted device, but Preston had not locked the screen before tossing it down. The display was still glowing, faintly illuminating a series of active text threads. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my dry throat. It was not just a phone. It was the absolute, undeniable holy grail of evidence. It contained direct, unencrypted messages with the overseas pharmaceutical buyers detailing the exact prices paid for the undocumented children, the schedule for the illegal drug infusions, and the offshore routing numbers used to hide the bloody millions. I clutched the device tightly in my fist. I finally had everything I needed to burn their entire world to ash. I stood in the center of the pale green room, gripping Preston's burner phone in my trembling hands. The screen glowed with undeniable proof of their billion-dollar syndicate. I scrolled through active text threads, reading cold negotiations with overseas pharmaceutical buyers. They discussed the sleeping toddlers as if they were delayed cargo shipments, haggling over offshore routing numbers and delivery timelines for experimental drug infusions. My immediate instinct was to dial emergency dispatch, to scream for local police to kick down my front door, and drag my daughter and her husband out in handcuffs. But the calculating mind of an engineer quickly overrode the fiery impulse of a furious father. Preston was sleeping one floor above me, armed with a suppressed handgun, possessing the ruthless mentality of a man facing life in federal prison. If patrol cars swarmed the driveway, Preston would not surrender peacefully. He would realize his operation was compromised, and his first objective would be to eliminate the physical evidence. He would rush down to this basement and execute these defenseless children before police could breach the front porch. I could not allow a standoff to jeopardize the toddlers I had sworn to protect. I needed to neutralize Preston and Natalie before the authorities arrived. I needed to turn their impenetrable fortress into my personal safe room. I slipped the burner phone into my jacket pocket alongside my own device and approached the massive biometric steel door. Preston had spared no expense when he ordered this vault, outfitting it with reinforced titanium plating, heavy internal deadbolts, and a state-of-the-art electronic motherboard. He believed the technology made his hidden medical ward entirely invincible from outside intrusion. What he failed to understand was that the man he cast as a senile scapegoat had spent 40 years designing complex structural and electrical schematics. I knew exactly how these electronic locking mechanisms were wired, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to break them permanently. I retrieved my pocket knife from my trousers, folding out the flathead screwdriver attachment. I knelt beside the heavy door and slid the metal tip into the seam of the interior access panel. I applied a slow, steady torque until the metal casing popped free, exposing a labyrinth of multicolored wires, green circuit boards, and blinking LED indicators. I clicked my flashlight on, holding it between my teeth to illuminate the electrical array. My hands moved with a swift, practiced fluidity that belied my 70 years of age. I visually traced the primary wiring harness connecting the internal motherboard to the external biometric fingerprint scanner. If Preston came down those stairs and pressed his thumb against that external glass plate, the computer would instantly send a low-voltage electrical pulse to retract the deadbolts. I needed to sever that external communication permanently, doing it without triggering the fail-safe alarm system that would alert his phone. I carefully separated a bundle of thin yellow and blue wires isolating the specific data transmission line. Using the sharp edge of my knife, I stripped the rubber casing away from the copper core. I bypassed the external relay, entirely twisting the exposed copper wires directly into the ground terminal of the internal power supply. A soft electronic click echoed from inside the heavy doorframe, followed by the dull, mechanical thud of the secondary safety locks engaging automatically. I had successfully flipped the switch. The biometric scanner on the outside of the door was now completely dead, severed from the power grid, and rendered useless. Preston could punch in whatever passcode he wanted. He could press his thumb against the glass until his skin bled, but the heavy steel door would never open from the outside again. The medical ward was now a one-way vault, and I was the only person who controlled the lock. With the physical perimeter secured, I turned my attention to the digital execution of my daughter and her husband. I walked over to the stainless steel rolling cart, pulling my personal phone and Preston's burner phone from my jacket. I needed to bypass local authorities entirely. Local police departments lacked the immediate jurisdiction, forensic resources, and tactical manpower to simultaneously secure a clandestine medical laboratory, intercept offshore wire transfers, and dismantle an international pharmaceutical ring. I needed the full, uncompromising weight of the federal government. I opened the encrypted browser on my phone and rapidly navigated to the secure tip portal for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically targeting their specialized human trafficking task force. I began to compile a massive, undeniable data dump. I uploaded the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the iron cribs, the heavy nylon restraints, and the towering intravenous saline drips. I attached the clear images of the forged medical nonprofit charters, the falsified property deeds, and the fraudulent Medicare billing files bearing my expertly forged signature. I did not stop there. I meticulously photographed every active text thread on Preston's burner phone, capturing the explicit conversations with the corrupt overseas doctors. I documented the exact routing numbers for the offshore shell accounts, the specific dates of the illegal monetary transfers, and the detailed pharmaceutical schedules for the dangerous experimental compounds. I typed out a concise summary of the entire operation, naming Preston and Natalie as the primary orchestrators of the trafficking ring. I detailed their plan to utilize heavy lead poisoning to induce temporary dementia in me, effectively manufacturing a convenient scapegoat for their crimes. I provided the exact address of my home, the location of the hidden sub-basement, and a strict warning that the male suspect was armed with a suppressed weapon. I reviewed the massive digital payload one final time, ensuring every piece of damning evidence was attached. My thumb hovered over the send button for a fraction of a second before I pressed down firmly. A small loading bar appeared on my screen, slowly filling with green light as the files transmitted through the cellular network. The progress bar hit 100%, and a small notification confirmed the successful delivery of the encrypted package to the federal database. The trap was now fully, irreversibly set. I placed both phones down on the stainless steel cart and walked slowly back to the row of iron cribs. The little boy Preston had sedated earlier was resting peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a quiet rhythm. I pulled up a medical stool and sat down directly in front of the heavy steel door. I crossed my tired arms, letting the deep, cold silence of the basement wash over me. I no longer felt the exhausting ache of my arthritis or the suffocating weight of my daughter's unimaginable betrayal. I felt only the cold, sharp focus of a man waiting for the inevitable storm. The sun would rise in exactly 3 hours. When the morning light finally broke over the dark horizon, the federal agents would descend upon this house, and the untouchable world my daughter had violently built would be utterly destroyed. I leaned back against the concrete wall, keeping my eyes fixed on the heavy metal door, and I waited for the monsters to wake up. The hours before dawn stretched into an agonizing eternity, marked only by the beeping of intravenous monitors and the shallow breathing of the sedated children. I remained perfectly still on the medical stool, my eyes fixed unblinkingly on the heavy titanium door. My physical body was exhausted, every joint screaming from the damp cold of the concrete basement, but my mind was operating with a crystalline, terrifying clarity. I was no longer the grieving widower they had manipulated. I was no longer the senile old fool they had poisoned. I was a father pushed past the absolute limit of human endurance, and I was holding the keys to their destruction. Around 6 in the morning, the faint gray light of early dawn began to filter through the narrow barred ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It was time. I stood up, my knees popping loudly, and moved toward the small enclosed utility closet adjacent to the medical ward. This was the central hub for the basement's electrical grid, a space Preston had ignored because it housed vintage circuit breakers and dusty fuse boxes. I stepped inside the cramped closet, leaving the door cracked open just enough to maintain a clear line of sight to the main entrance. I rested my hand on the heavy industrial master switch I had rewired during the night. At exactly 7:15, the heavy, muffled thud of footsteps vibrated through the floorboards directly above my head. They were awake. The unhurried cadence of their morning routine echoed through the house, a sickening contrast to the horrors contained beneath their feet. I heard the muffled hum of the plumbing system as they showered, the faint scrape of chairs pulling away from the kitchen island, and the soft murmur of their voices as they drank their morning coffee. I wondered with a dark, bitter irony if Natalie had poured my daily dose of lead into a cup only to realize I was not sitting at the table to consume it. 10 minutes later, the footsteps moved deliberately toward the basement door. My grip tightened on the cold metal handle of the master electrical switch. The heavy boots and the sharp click of high heels descended the wooden staircase, echoing loudly in the subterranean silence. I held my breath, watching the narrow sliver of the medical ward through the cracked utility door. Preston reached the bottom of the stairs first. I heard the frustrated sound of his palm slapping against the biometric glass scanner on the outside of the titanium door. A dull error indicating buzz filtered through the steel. He cursed loudly, complaining to Natalie that the primary security sensor was malfunctioning again. He muttered something about the cheap imported motherboard failing due to the basement moisture. Little did he know I had completely severed the external data line hours ago, rendering his fingerprint useless. I waited for him to punch in the manual override code on the secondary numerical keypad. The heavy electronic deadbolts groaned and retracted with a sluggish mechanical clack, fighting against the modified current I had established. The massive steel door swung inward on its heavy hinges. The bright, sterile fluorescent lights of the medical ward automatically flared to life, illuminating the room in a harsh, blinding glare. Preston stepped over the threshold, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, ready for another day of masquerading as a legitimate regional healthcare administrator. Natalie followed closely behind him, dressed in an elegant emerald green blouse and a dark skirt, her hair perfectly styled. They looked like an immaculate, successful young couple stepping into a corporate boardroom, rather than two ruthless monsters entering a clandestine human laboratory. They did not even glance at the iron cribs. They completely ignored the two sedated toddlers strapped to the mattresses. Their attention was entirely focused on the stainless steel rolling cart and the clinical trial documents they needed to prepare for the overseas buyers. Preston walked directly to the desk, his brow furrowing as he reached for the black leather portfolio. He realized instantly that the documents were out of order. He noticed that the thick stack of forged Medicare billing files had been moved. He turned around, his eyes scanning the sterile room with sudden, intense suspicion. He asked Natalie if she had reorganized the cart before they went to sleep. Natalie shook her head, her face paling, as she noticed the oxygen concentrators in the corner. She pointed a manicured finger toward the gray medical tarp, noting that it had been pushed aside. The moment of realization hit them simultaneously. A profound, paralyzing shock washed over their faces as they understood their impenetrable fortress had been breached. Preston reached frantically into his jacket pocket, searching for the heavy burner phone he had left on the desk the night before. His hand grabbed nothing but empty fabric. He tore the black leather portfolio open, pulling out the manila folders, wildly searching for the device that contained the direct communication lines to his corrupt pharmaceutical syndicate. I watched the absolute panic set in a delicious, vindicating terror that made my heart hammer with cold satisfaction. They were trapped in their own arrogance. It was time to close the cage. I tightened my grip on the handle of the master electrical switch. With one swift, violent motion, I yanked the heavy metal lever downward, breaking the primary circuit and unleashing the modified electrical surge I had prepared. A deafening, explosive crack echoed from the titanium doorframe as the electronic locking mechanism literally fried itself. Sparks showered from the internal access panel, raining down on the linoleum floor. The massive steel door, driven by the sudden loss of magnetic resistance and the heavy pneumatic hinges, swung violently shut. It slammed into the reinforced frame with a thunderous, earth-shaking boom that vibrated through the very foundation of the house. The heavy internal deadbolts fired into the concrete walls, sealing the vault permanently. Simultaneously, the fluorescent lights directly above them blew out with a sharp, synchronized pop. The basement was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness for a fraction of a second. Then the isolated emergency backup generator engaged. A series of caged, heavy-duty red bulbs flickered to life along the concrete walls, bathing the entire medical ward in a deep, eerie, blood-red glow. Preston screamed in the crimson darkness, a primal sound of absolute fury and terror. He drew his suppressed handgun and aimed it blindly at the shadows, demanding to know who was there. Natalie backed against the metal desk, her breathing rapid and shallow as panic consumed her. I reached up to the wall inside the utility closet and unhooked the microphone for the basement intercom system. I pressed the heavy plastic button on the side of the receiver, hearing the faint click of the speakers engaging in the medical ward. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the years of paternal love and bitter betrayal completely wash away, leaving only the cold, unyielding voice of a man who had reclaimed his home. My voice boomed through the overhead speakers, echoing loudly in the crimson-bathed room. "Morning, Natalie." I decided to come back early from fishing. The sharp, metallic distortion of my voice through the old intercom speakers hung heavily in the thick crimson air of the medical ward. For a fleeting second, absolute silence gripped the basement. Through the narrow gap in the utility closet door, I watched the profound, paralyzing shock wash over my daughter and her husband. Preston was the first to break the stillness. The primal terror in his eyes instantly morphed into explosive, unhinged violence. He raised his suppressed handgun, leveling it directly at the biometric sensor panel on the heavy titanium door. He pulled the trigger with reckless abandon. 3 muffled mechanical thwacks echoed rapidly as bullets sparked against the reinforced steel, ricocheting harmlessly off the dense metal plating. The door did not even dent. Preston cursed violently, kicking the unyielding barrier with his heavy tactical boot, sending a dull thud reverberating up my spine. He slammed his fists against the cold steel, roaring my name into the sterile room. I sat back on my medical stool inside the utility closet, my hand resting calmly over the intercom receiver. I let him tire himself out, watching as the terrifying reality of their inescapable cage slowly settled over them. When Preston finally paused, gasping for breath and leaning heavily against the reinforced door, Natalie stepped forward. The panic on her face vanished instantly, replaced by the sickeningly sweet, compassionate mask she wore so flawlessly. She stepped directly under the security camera, looking up at the lens with wide, pleading eyes. Her voice trembled with practiced, manufactured concern, transmitting crystal clear through the intercom receiver in my hand. "Dad," she called out, her tone dripping with false affection. "Dad, what are you doing? Please, you need to open this door right now. You are confused. You are having another one of your dementia episodes. You forgot to take your medication this morning, and your mind is playing tricks on you. We are just down here checking on the rescue dogs. Please, Daddy, you are scaring me. You need to let us out so I can make you some coffee and help you calm down." Her words, once capable of wrapping around my heart, now filled me with absolute freezing disgust. I pressed the transmission button on the plastic receiver. "There will be no more coffee, Natalie," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I am well aware of the secret ingredient you have been stirring into my mug every morning for the past 9 months. A microdose of heavy lead, right, just enough to induce localized neurological degradation, mimicking the rapid onset of aggressive dementia. A brilliant strategy to manufacture a senile scapegoat for your billion-dollar human trafficking ring." The manufactured warmth vanished entirely from Natalie's face. She froze, her mouth slightly open, staring blindly at the security camera. Beside her, Preston gripped his weapon tighter, his eyes darting frantically around the red-bathed room. I did not give them a moment to formulate another lie. I methodically began to tear their operation down to the studs, demonstrating the absolute, inescapable extent of my knowledge. I pressed the button again, speaking with the clinical precision of an engineer dismantling a faulty structure. I recited the specific alphanumeric names of the experimental autoimmune and neurological compounds they were pumping into the undocumented refugee toddlers. I listed the offshore shell company aliases registered under my forged signature. I read the exact routing numbers for the offshore banking accounts located in Belize and the Cayman Islands. I detailed the $2 million wire transfer Preston had received just days prior. I stripped away every shadow, every defense, and every arrogant delusion they held about their perfect, untraceable enterprise. As I read off the final offshore routing number, the last thread of Natalie's sweet daughter act violently snapped. The mask shattered completely, revealing the horrific, rotting truth beneath her beautiful features. She threw her head back and screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but a guttural, feral shriek of pure, unadulterated, demonic rage. Her face contorted into a vicious, unrecognizable snarl. She lunged toward the heavy steel door, slamming her manicured hands against the metal with such force I could hear her bones crack over the audio feed. She cursed me with a vile, venomous hatred that chilled the very marrow of my bones. "You pathetic, useless old fossil," she shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat. "You ruined everything. We were going to be rich. We were going to leave you to rot in a cell while we lived like royalty. You do not deserve this house. You do not deserve any of it. You are a weak, gullible idiot, and I have hated playing the loving daughter for you every single miserable day of my life. I should have given you a lethal dose of lead the moment Mom died. I should have watched you choke on it. Her monstrous confession echoed in the narrow concrete space, a heavy, suffocating confirmation of my deepest, darkest fears. She continued to rave, pacing the red-illuminated floor, like a trapped rabid animal spewing hatred and outlining the exact depths of her greed and malice. She boasted about how easy it was to steal the children, how she felt absolutely no remorse for the pain they suffered during the drug trials, and how she viewed them merely as disposable inventory for her financial gain. She laid bare the entirety of her corrupt black soul, screaming every horrific detail into the empty air, convinced she was only talking to a doomed, trapped old man on the other side of a locked door. I sat in the dark utility closet, listening to the vile echoes of her confession fade into heavy, ragged panting. I felt a strange, profound sense of closure. The daughter I had loved was truly dead, completely consumed by the monster standing in my basement. I pressed the intercom button one final time. My voice was calm, completely devoid of anger or sorrow. "Natalie," I said, the sound projecting smoothly into the medical ward. "I am glad you got all of that off your chest. I truly am. But you should know you are not just talking to your pathetic old father. I bypassed the local network hours ago. The communication terminal you left on your desk allowed me to establish a secure data link." I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the final devastating truth settle over the red-illuminated room. The audio from this intercom system is currently patched directly into an open live feed with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Human Trafficking Task Force, I explained clearly. They have been listening to every single word of your confession for the past 15 minutes. I watched the remaining blood completely drain from her face. Her knees buckled under the crushing weight of reality, and she collapsed onto the hard linoleum floor. Preston simply dropped his weapon, staring blankly at the unyielding titanium walls as the distant rising wail of approaching federal sirens finally broke the morning silence. It was over. The nightmare was finished. I stood up, opened the closet door, and walked upstairs to greet the arriving rescue teams. I left the utility closet behind each step up the wooden staircase, feeling lighter. The oppressive weight of the lead poisoning, the crushing betrayal, and the sheer terror of the night were lifting, replaced by the arrival of absolute justice. As I reached the main floor hallway, the wail of distant sirens began to multiply, weaving together into a piercing chorus that sliced through the morning air. The sound grew rapidly, transforming from a distant echo into a deafening roar as multiple heavy vehicles swarmed into my long driveway. Red and blue lights flashed frantically, casting violent shadows through the living room windows. I walked calmly toward the front entrance, my heart steady and my mind clear. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt on the mahogany front door and pulled it open just as the armored federal vehicles parked on the front lawn. Dozens of agents poured out of the tactical trucks. They were clad in heavy tactical gear, Kevlar vests bearing the bold letters of the FBI, and carrying assault rifles. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, establishing a secure perimeter around the entire property in a matter of seconds. I stepped out onto the front porch, raising both of my empty hands high into the cool morning air to demonstrate my immediate compliance. A tactical unit rushed up the brick steps, their weapons drawn, and their flashlights cutting through the dawn shadows. I did not flinch or back away. I kept my hands raised and my voice completely level, announcing myself clearly as Victor Hammond, the homeowner, and the individual who had transmitted the encrypted data package to the Human Trafficking Task Force. The lead agent signaled his team to lower their weapons. He approached me with rapid, commanding steps, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of deception. I quickly explained the exact tactical situation in the basement, detailing the layout of the medical ward, the location of the sedated children, and the current state of the suspects. I reached carefully into my jacket pocket, telegraphing every movement to avoid startling the heavily armed agents. I slowly pulled out the modified electronic master key I had wired to override the biometric scanner. I handed the device directly to the lead agent, explaining that the titanium door was currently sealed shut from the inside. I provided the exact sequence needed to bypass the fried motherboard, ensuring they could breach the room without resorting to explosive charges that might severely injure the helpless toddlers trapped inside. The tactical commander nodded sharply, taking the override device and signaling his breach team to move inside. They flooded past me through the front door, a highly trained wave of dark armor and focused aggression. I stood on the porch, flanked by 2 agents assigned to ensure my safety, listening as the heavy boots thundered down my main hallway toward the basement stairs. The absolute precision of their movement was a stark contrast to the chaotic, arrogant cruelty that Natalie and Preston had brought into my home. A separate convoy of unmarked medical vans pulled into the driveway behind the tactical vehicles, deploying teams of federal paramedics carrying specialized pediatric stretchers and emergency trauma equipment. They staged themselves at the front door, ready to extract the innocent victims the moment the basement was secured. Through the open front door, I heard the tactical team reach the bottom of the basement stairs. The commander's voice echoed up the stairwell, shouting the final breach orders. A sharp electronic tone signaled the successful activation of my manual override. The heavy titanium door, which Preston had foolishly believed was his impenetrable fortress, was violently thrown open. The aggressive overlapping shouts of the federal agents immediately filled the house, commanding the suspects to drop their weapons and get on the floor. I heard the distinct heavy thud of a physical struggle, followed rapidly by the sharp sound of handcuffs ratcheting tightly around wrists. Preston did not fire a single shot. His arrogant, ruthless bravery completely evaporated the moment he was faced with heavily armed federal authorities rather than defenseless children or an elderly man. A few minutes later, the call came over the tactical radios. The basement was secure, and the primary targets were in custody. I waited on the porch, my breathing shallow, praying that the medical team had arrived in time to reverse the damage caused by the experimental drug infusions. Shortly after, the paramedics emerged from the house, moving with urgent, practiced care. They pushed the 2 specialized pediatric stretchers down the brick steps. The little boy and the little girl were securely strapped in. Their small faces were pale, but their chests were rising and falling with natural, unassisted breaths. I watched them load the children into the waiting medical transport units, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over my tired soul. The rescue operation was finally complete. The 2 innocent children were safe. The terrifying long nightmare was over. Following close behind the medical teams, the federal agents finally brought out the monsters. Preston was dragged up the stairs first. His expensive tracksuit was torn, and his face was pressed firmly toward the floorboards. He was weeping openly, a pathetic, cowardly display from a man who had boasted about destroying my life just hours prior. The agents hauled him out the front door and shoved him roughly into the back of a waiting transport vehicle. He did not even look at me. He simply curled into a ball, completely broken by the sudden, absolute collapse of his illegal empire. Then Natalie appeared in the doorway. 2 agents held her firmly by the arms, forcibly guiding her out onto the porch. She was no longer wearing the compassionate, loving mask of the dedicated social worker. Her hair that was wild and unkempt, and her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She fought against the agent's grip, kicking her heels against the brick steps as they dragged her toward the driveway. She locked her furious eyes onto mine, refusing to look away. The sheer hatred radiating from her gaze was palpable, a dark, toxic energy that hung heavily in the crisp morning air. She violently jerked her shoulders, trying to break free just to get closer to me. "You have nothing." Without me, she screamed, her voice hoarse and raw with desperate rage. The words tore through the quiet neighborhood, a final vicious attempt to inflict pain. "You have absolutely no one left in this world. You will die alone in this massive empty house. You will die completely alone." I stood my ground on the porch, looking at the woman I had raised from childhood. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing but a profound pity for the hollow, monstrous creature she had willingly chosen to become. I slowly reached up with a steady hand, adjusting the lapels of my jacket. I met her venomous stare with cold, unwavering certainty. "I would rather die alone than live with a monster," I replied softly. The federal agents pulled her away, throwing her into the back of the armored van and slamming the doors shut, taking the darkness away forever. The heavy engine of the federal transport van roared to life, its thick tires crunching against the gravel as it began its slow descent down my long driveway. I stood on the front porch, the cool morning breeze cutting through the thin fabric of my jacket. I watched the taillights disappear past the iron gates, taking the monsters who had lived under my roof away from me permanently. My attention shifted to the pair of unmarked medical ambulances still idling near the manicured lawn. The paramedics were moving with a focused, quiet efficiency, securing the specialized pediatric stretchers into the back of the heavily equipped vehicles. The little boy and the little girl were resting peacefully now, their small chests rising and falling with a steady natural rhythm that brought a profound, aching relief to my soul. One of the senior medics, a tall woman with kind eyes and a weary expression, paused by the open doors of the ambulance. She caught my gaze across the distance and gave me a single affirming nod. It was a silent promise that the children were stable, that the heavy experimental compounds were being safely flushed from their fragile systems, and that they would survive the horrors they had endured in my sub-basement. The ambulance doors clicked shut, and the vehicles pulled away smoothly, carrying those innocent lives toward a future free from pain and exploitation. I exhaled a breath I felt I had been holding for days. The lead tactical agent walked up the brick steps of the porch, his heavy Kevlar vest shifting as he holstered his sidearm. He removed his protective helmet, revealing a face lined with exhaustion and grim satisfaction. He stopped a few feet away and extended his hand. I reached out and took it, feeling the firm, grounding grip of a man who had seen the absolute worst of humanity. He looked me directly in the eye, his voice low and intensely serious. He told me that the digital payload I had transmitted to the Human Trafficking Task Force was the most comprehensive, airtight collection of forensic evidence he had ever seen in his entire career. He explained that my meticulous photographs of the offshore banking ledgers, the fraudulent medical nonprofit charters, and the unencrypted communications on Preston's burner phone had provided them with everything they needed. The network was already collapsing. Federal raids were currently executing across 3 different states, systematically dismantling the corrupt pharmaceutical ring. He assured me with absolute unwavering certainty that Natalie and Preston would never see the outside of a federal penitentiary again. The magnitude of their crimes, spanning international human trafficking, massive medical fraud, and the attempted murder of a family member through heavy metal poisoning, guaranteed a sentence of life in prison without the slightest possibility of parole. I thanked the agent quietly, my voice a raspy whisper. He nodded respectfully, turned on his heel, and walked back to his command vehicle to finalize the crime scene perimeter. I was left completely alone on the porch of the massive, silent house I had built for my family. I turned around and walked slowly back through the heavy mahogany front door. The grand foyer with its sweeping wooden staircase and crystal chandelier felt entirely different now. It no longer felt like a home. It felt like a meticulously decorated tomb. I walked past the kitchen, my eyes instinctively avoiding the coffee maker on the marble counter. The lingering metallic taste of the lead Natalie had secretly fed me seemed to rise in the back of my throat, a phantom reminder of the absolute calculated evil she had harbored. I had spent 40 years of my life working tirelessly as a structural engineer, pouring every ounce of my sweat and energy into providing a secure, privileged life for my daughter. I had given her everything, believing that blood was the ultimate unbreakable bond. I had believed that family was defined by genetics, by shared history, and by unquestioning loyalty. Standing in the dead center of my empty living room, the crushing emotional toll of the past 24 hours finally crashed over me. The betrayal was absolute, a profound, agonizing wound that no amount of time or distance could ever truly heal. My daughter was a monster, a hollow, greedy shell who had willingly traded the lives of undocumented orphans for luxury cars and offshore bank accounts. She had looked at me, the man who had raised her, and seen only a convenient, disposable scapegoat. But within that crushing realization, a strange, liberating clarity began to form. I realized with absolute certainty that blood does not make a family. Blood is merely a biological coincidence. True family is forged through compassion, through self-sacrifice, and through the unwavering commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Natalie had severed our bond the moment she brought those children into this house. I owed her absolutely nothing. By the following Monday, I sat in the polished conference room of my personal attorney. I did not waste time with tears or regrets. I instructed him to immediately and aggressively liquidate my entire estate. The massive house with the biometric steel door in the basement was put on the market, sold to a commercial developer who planned to tear it down and build a generic subdivision. I wanted the structure erased from the earth. I signed the countless stacks of legal documents required to dissolve the fraudulent medical shell companies Natalie had registered in my name, working directly with federal prosecutors to seize the offshore accounts and repatriate the stolen Medicare funds. I systematically removed my name from every single asset, every property, and every investment portfolio tied to my past life. I watched as the vast accumulated wealth of a 40-year career was converted into liquid, untethered capital. I did not keep the millions for myself. I had absolutely no desire to live a life of isolated luxury built on the ashes of such profound horror. Instead, I directed my attorney to establish a highly secure, heavily endowed blind trust. I funneled the entirety of my life savings, my corporate retirement accounts, and the proceeds from the sale of the estate directly into this new foundation. The trust was structured with one specific, unalterable purpose. It was designed to provide comprehensive, lifelong support for the 2 refugee toddlers I had found strapped to the iron cribs in my basement. The funds were locked tightly behind complex legal parameters, ensuring that the children would receive top-tier medical care to reverse the effects of the experimental compounds, access to premium education, and a permanent, unshakable financial safety net for the rest of their natural lives. They had arrived in this country as untraceable ghosts, vulnerable to the absolute worst predation humanity had to offer. I was making certain they would grow up as protected, cherished individuals with every possible resource at their disposal. I refused to let them become victims again. I wanted their future to be completely bright, erasing every shadow my horrible daughter had cast upon them. Now I walk alone, but I carry a profound peace, knowing absolute justice prevailed. Exactly 6 months have passed since that terrifying dawn, when the heavy doors of the armored federal transport van slammed shut, taking the 2 people I had trusted most away from my life forever. Time is a peculiar thing when you are forced to rebuild your entire existence from the ashes of a catastrophic betrayal. At first, the days were a chaotic blur of grueling depositions, endless meetings with aggressive forensic accountants, and exhaustive legal procedures required to completely untangle my name from their sprawling criminal enterprise. But slowly, the deafening noise began to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm. I purchased a small, modest house wrapped around a sprawling wooden porch, nestled deep within a quiet coastal community far away from the dark memories of the city. There are no biometric steel doors here. There are no hidden basements or secret medical wards. The air smells of salt and blooming jasmine, rather than the sterile, metallic scent of a hidden laboratory. I sit in my sturdy rocking chair this morning, feeling the warm golden sunlight wash over my face. The gentle sea breeze rustles the leaves of the old oak tree in my front yard. The physical and emotional toll of realizing your entire family is a carefully constructed lie is a burden that defies simple explanation. For months, I wrestled with a suffocating, toxic mixture of profound grief and burning rage. I questioned every memory, every shared holiday, and every smile my daughter had ever given me. I wondered how I could have been so incredibly blind, to the monstrous reality hiding just beneath the surface of her elegant demeanor. The trial was a publicized, grueling spectacle. I sat in the austere federal courtroom, looking directly into the hollow, furious eyes of Natalie as the prosecutors meticulously dismantled her entire life. They laid bare the horrifying extent of the pharmaceutical ring, presenting the undeniable evidence of their offshore accounts and the forged medical charters. The federal judge showed absolutely no mercy. When the final gavel struck the wooden block, condemning both Natalie and Preston to serve life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of parole, I felt a strange, profound emptiness. There was no joy in watching my only child being led away in heavy iron chains. There was only the solemn, heavy knowledge that absolute justice had been served. I reach over to the small circular glass table beside my rocking chair and pick up the morning edition of the regional newspaper. The bold black ink of the front page headline immediately catches my attention. It reads, "Massive International Pharmaceutical Syndicate dismantled key operatives sentenced to life behind bars." The detailed article outlines the sweeping, massive raids that resulted from the comprehensive data dump I transmitted on that fateful night. It describes the complete collapse of a sophisticated black market medical operation that exploited undocumented immigrants and vulnerable refugees for illegal drug trials. The journalist notes that the entire syndicate was brought to its knees thanks to the meticulous, undeniable evidence provided by an anonymous, highly intelligent whistleblower. I slowly trace my thumb across the rough paper, reading the printed words with a quiet, settling sense of ultimate vindication. The corrupt doctors, the ruthless offshore buyers, and the arrogant organizers are all locked away in concrete cells. They underestimated the quiet, grieving old man. They assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness, and my patience was a sign of senility. The senile old man meticulously planned their ultimate destruction, and the senile old man definitively won. I carefully fold the newspaper and place it back on the glass table. Next to it rests a thick official envelope bearing the formal seal of the state foster care agency. My legal team had to fight through a labyrinth of rigid bureaucratic procedures to establish the secure blind trust, ensuring the vast funds from my liquidated estate were properly allocated without revealing my identity to the public. The trust operates anonymously, providing limitless financial backing for the specific medical recovery, specialized education, and psychological support of the toddlers rescued from the iron cribs in my former basement. I slide my finger beneath the paper flap and open the envelope. It contains a detailed quarterly progress report compiled by the dedicated social workers overseeing their specific cases. My heart begins to beat with a steady, hopeful rhythm as I pull out the neatly typed pages. Attached to the very front of the official document is a small, vibrant photograph. I hold the glossy picture up to the morning sunlight, studying the image with a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute gratitude. The little boy and the little girl are standing together in a bright, grassy park, completely surrounded by warm sunlight. They look remarkably different from the pale, sedated ghosts I had guarded in the crimson darkness of that terrifying underground vault. Their cheeks are full and rosy, their eyes are bright and alert, and they are holding hands, flashing genuine, carefree smiles at the camera. The comprehensive report details their miraculous physical recovery. The heavy experimental chemical compounds have been completely flushed from their young systems, leaving absolutely no lasting neurological damage or developmental delays. They have been placed together in a permanent, loving home with a carefully vetted, compassionate family who will raise them with the tenderness and respect they so desperately deserve. The blind trust I created has already covered the total cost of their specialized pediatric care, secured their future college tuitions, and established a substantial safety net that will protect them for the rest of their natural lives. Reading the clinical but incredibly uplifting words, a warm, healing tear slowly escapes my eye and rolls down my weathered cheek. This is the true, enduring legacy I have chosen to leave behind. I did not simply destroy the monsters who invaded my home. I successfully redirected their stolen wealth to restore the beautiful, innocent lives they tried to ruin. I leaned back into the comfortable cushions of my rocking chair, letting the gentle, rhythmic motion soothe my tired bones. The horrific memories of the titanium door, the blinking electronic locks, and the heavy lead poisoning are finally beginning to fade into the distant background of my mind. They are replaced by the vibrant, smiling faces of the children in the photograph resting gently in my lap. I have lost my biological daughter, but I have gained a profound, unshakable understanding of what true family actually means. Blood is merely an accident of birth, a coincidence that guarantees absolutely nothing about any human character, loyalty, or morality. I chose to tear down my own world to protect strangers, and in doing so, I found a deep, abiding peace that no amount of money could ever purchase. The morning sun continues to climb higher into the clear blue sky, casting a warm, brilliant light over the wooden porch. The air is entirely clear, free from deception, free from manipulation, and free from the suffocating darkness of betrayal. I take a long, deep breath of the fresh, salty coastal air and quietly smile. The terrifying long nightmare is finally and completely over for good. The hardest truth any parent can ever face is that the child they lovingly raised might not be the person they thought they knew. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a smiling face can easily hide the darkest of intentions. I learned that ignoring your gut feeling just to keep the peace will only make you a victim in your own home. True strength is not about protecting your family at all costs. It is about having the courage to tear down your own world when you realize it is built on evil. Morality must always come before toxic blood. If you have ever had to make a painful decision to protect yourself from a toxic family member, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it there right now? Please like and subscribe for more gripping stories. Your support means everything to me.